So let's talk swarms, cultists and grunt infantry, and why the lowest of the low in Warhammer 40k are actually rather handy to have on the battlefield. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today I thought we'd talk about a few units in Warhammer 40k that aren't exactly going to be carrying the heart of the battle, but instead skittering around the objectives and the peripheries of combat, but actually really have quite a lot of value for their points and turning the game to your favour. These kind of units have definitely had a bunch of names over the years, things like Chaff Units, or Action Monkeys when actions were a thing in 9th edition, Screening Units, or Cheap Trash Infantry. Whatever you call them, in general they're units that just cost very little, usually the very lowest points costs in most factions' indexes, bar the odd cheap character, and are generally just not really all that good for their damage output whatsoever. Not good to kill many of the enemy's foes at all, but occasionally a cheap expendable unit can still even be good, even if it's still not good defensively for the points either. There's just a lot of value for having a unit in Warhammer 40k that's just very low in points cost, even if it does almost nothing in contributing to the game. I was kind of inspired to talk about this by a few of the tier list polls that I've been doing for various factions in 40k. A few examples like this, like Tyrannid Rippers or Necron Scarab Swarmers, were often voted towards the bottom of their armies, these votes being in the polls that I was making to judge people's interpretation of how strong each unit is. I feel like they kind of are just undervalued by the community as a whole, and perhaps for understandable reasons. They're really quite cheap and don't do much damage, and a lot of them have objective control 0 as well, so it's not like they can help you out on the primaries. Obviously it's not all of these that are underrated. Certain units like Orc Gretchen are well known to be very good for the cost, even if damage isn't their main thing. Even a few of the more underrated ones though, they are generally seeing play in at least some competitive lists. They are handy to have around, and secondary and tactical objectives are probably the single biggest reason, but they can also add a fair bit on top of that, which they'll probably do going along after they've scored you some points. Before we talk about a few of their advantages, probably worth just talking about what one of these things is and what would make a good one. And in general it's the units that have the absolute lowest points cost possible, often tending to be small units of swarms or any types of infantry that can be taken in very small squads that are also quite cheap and low value individually. Probably one of the single most important things that they can be is durable for their points cost. They don't have a big points cost, but if they can soak up more firepower than they're really worth, then all well and good. And then within these units, they get bonus points if they get fast movements to jump around to objectives or table quarters or harass the enemy army. Deep Strike, Infiltrate and Scouts is all very valuable to control the midfield and give you more board control. Again, that's one of the biggest value of these. Actually being able to contest primary objectives is a nice positive if they have it, though many can't, like these Nurglings. And if they just also happen to be somewhat effective at killing enemy light infantry or even anything tougher, then so much the better, though generally that isn't their main purpose. Anything else they might be able to do, like debuffing the enemy or farming command points like Gretchen can, that's just added value at this point. Just for a few common, maybe slightly stronger examples of these, Orc Gretchen are perhaps one of the best. I think a lot of the swarm units would fall into this category, things like Scarab Swarms or Nurglings, Tyrannid Rippers, though they might be a little bit eclipsed at the moment. For the Imperium, there's been a lot of popping up of the Adeptus Arbites Exaction squads. Hopefully I might make a video covering them in a bit more detail in the future. Though some of the Imperial factions can field things of their own right, maybe Sisters of Silence for Adeptus Custodes, Crusaders or Death Cult Assassins for Adeptus Auroritas, or perhaps Fenrisian Wolves or Cyber Wolves for the Space Wolves. Chaos might be best served by things like Cultists or Poxwalkers. Kroot Hounds are quite a nice example for the Tau, and arguably things like the Spore Mines launched by Biovores might be them on basically God tier from the Tyranids, basically a unit that can spam out little ones of these units. Almost no value by damage and defense, but deep striking all over the board helps out a lot for board control and secondaries. I guess a few single model things might fit the bill as well, things like Tyranid Pyrovores that are quite cheap. And there are plenty of examples of things that operate kind of similarly to these, but actually have a little bit of extra value as well. Maybe doing nice things like jumping on and off the board, or actually having some decent damage to speak of. Maybe things like Tau Vespid or Tyranid Gargoyles with their move shoot move. As mentioned, certainly the single biggest draw to taking these is generally tactical secondary objectives in Warhammer 40k right now. Having a few of these units along is generally going to make it easy to score really quite a lot of cards in the mission deck. You often get points just for having units in certain places and doing nothing at some point, and if that can be a really cheap unit that you don't care too much about, that's going to be far better than committing something big and important to doing nothing. It seems that at least at the moment, the Objective Control 0 units can do all of these secondaries as well, meaning that while they can't score primaries, they still have really quite a lot of objective scoring potential going around and doing these little missions. It does seem that a lot more people are using these tactical flexible missions as opposed to the fixed primaries right now. They do generally tend to score a bit more. And there's quite a lot of cards that you can draw out of the tactical deck that are really relevant for these units, things like engage in all fronts, being in the different table quarters, behind enemy lines by dropping into the enemy drop zone, deploying teleport homers, either doing actions in the midboard or in the enemy deployment zone, investigate signal to be in the board quarters, which is perhaps a particularly nice place for these little units to be, and they could help out with the cleanse action as well, cleansing objectives and not stopping all your other units from doing things while they sit around doing the action. For scoring secondary points in particular, things like deep strikers or fast movers seem to be particularly good for this. Say having a Guard Tempesta Scion squad drop down, they're only 60 points even if they don't manage to do anything meaningful for damage. If you have just traded that for victory points, it could be worth it, and more so for cheaper things like say Tyrannid Rippers or Demon Nurglings. Even for slow and moving cheap infantry, they could be well worth putting in strategic reserve to have a bit of disruption coming in from the board edges. The opponent's deployment zone stuff might be a bit limited until turn 3 though. I still think that the Tyrannid Biovores are pretty excellent for this though. Just fire them out exactly where you want them, whether it is at the corners of the board, in different table quarters, or into the enemy backfield. You've basically got an endless supply of deep striking junk units. I'd say that's generally the biggest advantage they'll usually have, but after their work's done, or against certain units they can have a whole load of other applications on the board. They still give you nice wins for your army, even if you don't actually kill anything meaningful. Screening out enemy deep strikes and reserves is perhaps a particularly good job for these guys. They can have a big board footprint if spread out to the maximum, and a big 9-inch exclusion zone around them. Even a small squad of Crooked Hounds or something could lock out really quite a lot of space. And while you probably don't want any unit ideally exposed to enemy shooting, if screening out deep strike is critical, then if anything is going to be exposed to enemy firepower, it may as well be your very cheapest units. For Crooked Hounds, you could have them scout into the mid-board and hide turn 1, and then fan out turn 2 so your opponent can drop absolutely nowhere near you. In a similar sort of screening vein, just absorbing damage can be well worth it. Again, another good reason to have them on the edge of your army even if your opponent doesn't have deep strikers. Generally, it's going to be the most outlying units in your force that get engaged before anything else, so if anything's going to take the hit, it might as well be the very cheapest stuff that's not actually that dangerous. And even better if the opponent surprisingly rolls low and doesn't actually manage to clear them. You could use them to block movement or block charges, particularly handy if you've got one of these nuisance units just straddling a couple of ruins and the enemy vehicles or monsters can't get through. And then if your opponent's forced to charge these, they might put an important melee unit somewhere that is going to be exposed to a counter-attack. If melee is the only way to clear them, it can sometimes be worth just having these rubbishy units just right out in the open. Then they charge the unit and kill it dead, and then their own unit is right out in the open and all ready for you to go to town on with your actual good units. A few of these little Horde and Swarm units can be really quite tanky against quality fire as well. The Swarms get a whole load of wounds per point, more so than most things in Warhammer 40k. And same for Orc Gretchen, you get a lot of models for your 45 points, you might just literally have more models than the enemy has shots, so you know they can't get wiped out this turn. You can also have plenty of value out of a charge as well, even if you don't deal any meaningful damage. Nuisance charges are definitely a thing in 40k. Perhaps some of the best things to just lock up in combat could be things like enemy infantry with scary ranged weapons, something that doesn't really have enough combat damage to destroy your entire nuisance unit, but also is really not going to want to fall back and waste all their firepower. So being pinned in their own deployment zone turn 1 by a charging unit could be very nasty for them, and it could also limit their movement as well, having to both go around the swarm if they did fall back, and not being able to advance as well. Obviously they do need to have a little bit of resilience in melee if they're going to survive that. Maybe things like Nurglings could be an okay shout for that. A very cheap unit at 40 points for 3 bases of these. At that kind of cost, if it makes sense to risk it, they could set up somewhere fairly close to the enemy army and be all ready for a first turn charge on something that they really don't want charged by chaff swarms. Could definitely start the opponent's game off on a back foot and maybe keep a scary unit out of the fight for a turn or so. I know quite a lot of these can't actually hold primary objectives as they have objective control 0, but there's quite a lot of things that have at least a little bit of objective control, or even some slightly higher investment units that can work in a similar sort of way, and in the right games you could potentially entrust such units with the control of a safe primary, maybe something that's really quite hidden from enemy firepower and they don't have an obvious way to reach out and destroy your unit, whether it ignores line of sight firepower or fast movers to move around and engage your squad. There's a fair few armies out there that have a lot of really big tanky units where they can't really get much that isn't very high investment. Perhaps things like Space Marines, Adeptus Custodes, and Imperial Knights might often be typical ones for that. They might often enjoy just having one of these cheap units around just to hold down a point so they don't have to dedicate anything more to it, and everything else can just get into the serious business of getting stuck into the enemy and destroying them. I think perhaps one of the better examples for this for the Imperium could be the Adeptus Arbites Exaction Squad, which does seem to be making its way into really quite a lot of Imperial lists. 35 points for a small squad of 5 guys with 4+ carapace armor. They get a feel no pain from the medic, and they each have 1 point of objective control, meaning that you can have an objective at least fairly solidly locked down by them, and you've not really spent anything more than 35 points. Orc Gretchen are pretty excellent for that as well. 2 objective control each, 11 models for just 45 points, so anything with a lot of really big high quality shots just won't be able to kill them fast, and their special rule is to loot the objectives to get you some command points as well, so about as good value as you can possibly get for a tiny investment. I think it is quite fun as well that you could flex between these per game, so say for example if a Chaos Demon player had some Nurglings about, perhaps one game you could have them deployed up front and use them to move block a bunch of Knight Armigers first turn, not being able to get out of their own deployment zone because you've got some Nurglings in the gap between the 2 terrain pieces could be a big thing. Another game maybe you could just put them in Deep Strike and use them to come down for secondaries that you might draw. And another game you might be able to threaten a first turn charge, perhaps set them up in the midfield, somewhere hidden out of line of sight in some ruins, and if you get first turn, perhaps have enough movement to charge down some enemy ranged infantry that really don't want to be in close combat with something they can't kill very fast right from turn 1. Overall, really quite a lot of fun that you can have with these guys while they go about their thing, doing secondary objectives and scoring you a few points. I feel like really quite a lot of the lists that can take these can get some good value out of them, though generally I think you're going to get diminishing returns if you start to take too many. I say for a 2000 point list, maybe something like 1 or 2 units of them, perhaps around 50 to 100 points if your army has access to good ones, then maybe a bit more if you have access to some very nice ones like Orc Gretchen. Tyranids being able to farm them with the Biovores certainly have a whole load of Biovores as almost auto-includes within lists. I think in general with that sort of points investment, they're pretty handy to help with a mission and manage the enemy force, whether it's wasting some of their firepower or screening back some of their deep strikers and forcing them to fight chaff. I feel like it's quite a good reason to have some little guys in your force, as well as just the big exciting stuff that deals all the damage. I have a feeling at some point there might be a chance that Games Workshop could update the tactical missions to require units to have some objective control to be able to do them. I feel like we've had that one once before in 9th edition, where for a while a lot of people were running tiny units like servitors to turn up and do some retrieve data actions. Not sure whether they'd go down a similar sort of route that time, but I think there's a reasonable chance it might not be any time soon. Maybe things like a chapter approved book or a new mission deck might be the most likely time for it to happen if it ever does. Until then though, I think a good chunk of these will remain solid competitive staples, obviously varying one army to another, but there's a lot of forces out there that can get some pretty good value out of these guys. In any case, let me know your thoughts. How have you been enjoying your swarms and chaff units in Warhammer 40k? Have they been working out well for the battlefield for you? And let me know any surprising things that yours might have done. It's always good fun when these guys every so often punch above their weight, and a bit of heroism from the swarms on the battlefield. If you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics. I'll certainly keep the regular 40k discussions coming. I do tend to post new things just about every day. Finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and you can find that linked in the video description if you'd like to help support. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things happen next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some really big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.